they are uniquely Australian. There's a flavour element there, on top of the fact that Kangaroo Island is just an Australian place. It sounds Australian, it is Australian, and these spirits taste Australian. Hey there, I'm Nath Martin, the Whisky Scribe. Taste is subjective, whiskey is diverse, and this channel is all about understanding it well enough to enjoy it on your own terms. So today I've got a couple of samples of yet unreleased whiskey from Kangaroo Island Spirits. So we actually have a distillery on an island called Kangaroo Island. There are some kangaroos on there. Now, Kangaroo Island is located 13 kilometres off the southern coast of Australia near Adelaide in the Southern Ocean. So at just over 4,500 square kilometres, it is Australia's third largest island, known for pristine wilderness, wildlife and gourmet local produce. Yes, there are kangaroos there, but there are also things like sea lions, koalas, echidnas, platypus and plenty of bird life. So as far as Australian distilleries go, it doesn't get much more Australian than that. But the distillery, Kangaroo Island Spirits, was founded in 2006 as Australia's first dedicated gin distillery. And it was founded by a man named John Lark. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because Bill Lark, his brother, is the reason we have a whiskey industry in Australia today. So a lot of the laws and restrictions in Australia meant that it was almost impossible to start a new whiskey distillery. There were no whiskey distilleries in Australia. And in '95, he fought to get the laws changed so that we could actually start making whiskey in Australia again. So the entire existence of the Australian whiskey industry is credited to Bill Lark. That's why we call him the godfather of Australian whiskey. But his brother, John Lark, also made whiskey and other spirits with him. He's quite experienced in that, and it was in 2006 that he co-founded the Kangaroo Island Spirits. And for years they were just making gin and vodka and other liqueurs and things like that, award-winning spirits. And in 2018 they turned their hand to making Australian whiskey. But they didn't just start making whiskey with whatever grain they could buy. In 2018, they specifically sought out locally island-grown Westminster barley so that they could produce an authentically Australian island whiskey shaped by the local environment. It's worth mentioning that Kangaroo Island has never ever had anything genetically modified grown on the island. The Westminster barley is not genetically modified. They've never had any GMO produce grown on Kangaroo Island. In fact, the only thing that happens with the process of making this whiskey that doesn't happen on the island is the barley itself has to get sent off to the mainland to be malted and then sent back to the island, just because they don't have the malting capacity on the island. But everything else it's a 100%, it's an island distillery, which I think is really, really cool. I haven't actually tried the whiskey yet though. So let's check this out. So whiskey from a different point of view. Distilled, matured and bottled on Kangaroo Island. That was so cool. This tasting kit showcases our core range of whiskies. The influence of the Southern Ocean, along with temperate summers and mild island winters, creates unique conditions that allow the spirit to mature at its own pace. Each expression has followed a different path through maturation, drawing on the influence of the cask, climate and time to reveal a distinct side of the same island-style whiskey. While matured in different casks, they share a common thread, shaped by place, climate, and a patient approach to making whiskey. Together, these whiskies reveal the refined character and natural elegance that make Kangaroo Island's spirit truly unmistakable. And I have a little note here. Howdy, my name is Charlie Schmidt and I'm the head distiller at Kangaroo Island Spirits. We sent you this sample pack because we think you might be someone who would appreciate a good Australian single malt whiskey. They're not wrong. Our aim from the start was to make a quality Australian whiskey that's affordable for the common man. I think we've done that. Anyway, have a taste and let us know what you think. If you like it, we want to know more about our story, then get in touch. If you don't like it, I'd like to hear from you anyway, though not as much. Honest, I like that. So the whiskies that we've got here, there's a bourbon cask, which is a great core expression to always start with, lets you actually appreciate the whiskey itself. And then we've got an Apera cask and a Tawny cask. Now when I get to each, I'll actually explain what those barrels mean if you're not from Australia. So I'm going to start with the bourbon cask. Kangaroo Island single malt bourbon cask. Aged in bourbon casks, they actually tell us it's Jack Daniel's, Heaven Hill and Buffalo Trace. Non-age statement, non-chill filtered, no color added, 43%. There's some great legs going on in there. I love an oily whiskey. That always gives me great hope. That tells me that it's going to bring a lot of flavors from the barrel into the whiskey itself that will hopefully linger around on the palate. There's an interesting green note happening on the nose there. At the very first whiff, my thought was that it was like a bit of like a young sort of scent, the scent of a young whiskey. But I don't think it's that. Maybe it's a teeny little bit of aniseed on the nose. Yeah, a little bit of like a green sort of grass and an aniseed sort of note. Anyway, slange. That's really unique. I haven't had, that I'm aware of, any other whiskies made with Westminster barley. There's a very sort of fresh, almost herbal note going on in there. Now this is a proper single malt in that it hasn't had additives put in there, but it's almost like it's got some botanicals as a gin would. Yeah, there's a faint bit of like vanilla coming from the wood, but I don't get like a woody particularly note. There's a little bit of fruity sweetness, but if anything, more so than anything else, I'm getting like this herbal sort of note coming across, which is incredibly unique. And I don't know if that's coming from the aging environment, the fact that, you know, Kangaroo Island has got a very temperate sort of climate. They don't get a lot of temperature fluctuations compared to some places in Australia. Reportedly, their angel share is somewhere between 2 and 4% a year, which for an Australian distillery, that is fantastic. The exposure to the breezes from the Southern Ocean. Yeah, I can't get over that herbal element. The finish itself is sort of like more of the short to medium range. It's clean and nice, but it does like maybe more medium. It's sort of fading out quietly, but it's a very gentle finish. I just can't get over that herbality. That tastes quite Australian. There's a lot of Australian whiskies out here that are made in a very Scottish style, and they just sort of end up tasting like a Scottish whiskey that's aged in a hotter climate. But this is something of its own. So far we're off to a good start, but I can't wait to also try the Apera and the Tawny cask. So let's we'll move to the Apera. So for those who don't know, there are legal protections on the term sherry. Sherry can only be called sherry if it's made from the Andalusia region of Spain. But in Australia, for years we were making sherry, we're making wonderful sherry, but we can't call it that anymore because it's made in Australia, so we call it Apera. Bit more. So the Kangaroo Island single malt, aged in Apera casks. All casks are sourced from South Australian wineries. It's a non-age statement, non-chill filtered, no colour added, 43%. Now you can see the colour on here, we're getting like a little bit more of like a golden copper sort of note going on. And again, lovely thick legs. On the nose, again, there's a background element of herbality here, but I'm getting a very jammy note. So sort of like your fruit preserves, which is what jam is, I know. I can't get over that herbal note in there though. I wonder if that is influenced by the local environment or if that is just something that actually comes from the Westminster barley. If you've specifically had a whiskey made from Westminster barley, I would love to know like what is considered the normal flavor notes that you get from that grain. But I'm going to go in for a taste here, slange. First impression, there's a real sort of creaminess that's coming across. Those herbal notes are very, very nicely, softly infused with this creamy sort of texture, and that's the first thing that I'm getting off the palate here. There's a sweetness to it, but it's not especially sweet. It's a very warm sherry sort of sweetness. So I find sometimes with a sherry aged whiskey, sometimes that sweetness can be a little bit sharp. This is very soft and creamy and very easygoing on the palate. And I mentioned that there was that herbality on the nose, and it did carry across on the first sip. That's dissipating a little bit. It's still in the background a little bit, and I'm starting to think that that might actually be the signature of Kangaroo Island Spirits, that herbal sort of background sort of note. And that creamy sweetness, it does actually linger a fair bit. So I'd call it sort of like a medium to a long finish. That's really, really nice. I do like that. I'm always nervous with a new Australian whiskey distillery because I want to like Australian distilleries. I get quite disappointed when an Australian distillery releases a whiskey that either isn't ready yet or isn't that great. Doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen, and I'm never going to trash talk them here on the channel. If I come across an Australian whiskey that I don't like, because I know this is an emerging industry, and there's a lot of work that goes into it, and I don't want a distillery to be tarnished too much by their first release or two. So if I'm ever sent like a sample of an Australian whiskey that I don't think is good, I'm not going to lie to you about it, but I'm also not going to post a review, because our industry is still growing. It's in its early days. It doesn't need to be trash talked at this stage. It needs support. I'm not going to lie, but I'm also not going to show a whole lot of support for a whiskey distillery that's not releasing good product just yet. I'm just not going to share that with you. So far, these first two whiskies are really, really nice. I'm enjoying them. They've got a signature herbal note, which is great when a distillery has a distinct flavor that is carrying across whiskey to whiskey, because that becomes a signature, that becomes something you expect from that distillery, and for this one it is unique, it is uniquely Australian, which is fantastic. And you can tell I like this because I'm about to finish the glass. So that's the Apera cask. Next we got the Tawny. Again, for those who don't know, Tawny is what we have to call port in Australia. Again, port has got restrictions. You can only call it port if it's from the correct region within Portugal. And Australia had been making award-winning port before those restrictions came in, so we've had to change ours to be called Tawny. There's a local winery not far from where I am, and they changed the name of their port. They changed it to Starboard because it's not port. Starboard on a ship is the opposite of port. They called their port Starboard, in brackets, not port. So the Kangaroo Island single malt, aged in Tawny casks, sourced from South Australian wineries again, non-age statement, non-chill filtered, no colour added, 43%. I mean, again, just look at those legs. That's exactly what I want to see in a whiskey. Similar colouring to the Apera. I do think they're doing a bit of like a charring, there's a shaming and recharring process going on there, so they're not just throwing the whiskey into a wet barrel. On the nose, this is your classic dark fruits and Christmas cake sort of aroma on the nose. So it's not the sharp sweetness, it is that sort of soft, earthy sort of sweetness coming across, but it is that combination of dark fruits and Christmas cake. The herbal note that I got on the Bourbon cask and the Apera cask are still there, but it's a lot softer. Yeah, so it's background, but I would still probably call it like a signature sort of aroma of the Kangaroo Island Spirits. But on the palate, slange. This isn't exceptionally sweet. Like, I'm not getting that sharp sort of sweetness that you sometimes get from a port cask, but I'm getting the other flavors that often get carried across with sweetness. So I'm getting like this very earthy, oily sort of note that I would almost call dark chocolate, but without any of the sweetness that comes across, but also without the bitterness, which I like because I love dark chocolate, but what usually makes me like steer away from it is there's often a bit of bitterness with dark chocolate. There's only a few dark chocolates that I like. This has got that creamy, earthy sort of note. There's a lot of those, it's like plum and dark chocolate, but without the sharp sweetness, which is actually a really, really good thing because it makes it quite drinkable. I find if it's too sweet, you can only have so much of it in one go. I actually think this would be a very sessionable whiskey. I didn't pour enough to properly appreciate this. I'm actually going to give myself a little bit more. Yeah, it's very, very creamy and earthy sort of flavors that are normally sweet adjacent, but they're not coming across with a whole lot of sweet. Like, don't get me wrong, there is some sweetness there. It's kind of soft and creamy, and there's a little bit of sweetness, but it's not too sweet. It's letting the other flavor notes, that sort of, there's a little bit of grain going on. There's sort of maybe a little bit of burnt butter, but you've got Christmas cake, you've got dark orchard sort of fruits, like sort of your plum sort of notes coming in there. But I would call the oiliness of it sort of like a dark chocolate oiliness without the sweetness of dark chocolate. And the finish is sort of medium to long. It's all those notes you get on the palate, they very slowly recede, which I really, really like. It's not like the finish is any different to the palate. It's just that the palate takes a very long time to dissipate, which is really cool. The interesting thing is though that the Tawny cask doesn't have anywhere near the same level of herbality of the Bourbon and the Apera cask. It's still very, very faintly in the background, so I do think that is a signature note of the Kangaroo Island Spirits that they're producing. But it's cool. Each whiskey is its own thing. It's got enough to tie it all together that it comes from the one distillery, but each one is still its own spirit. They are uniquely Australian. There's a flavour element there, on top of the fact that Kangaroo Island is just an Australian place. It sounds Australian, it is Australian, and these spirits taste Australian, which is what I like to see. If you're going to be having a whiskey that's outside of like your core Irish and Scotland sort of bases, it should have an element that tastes unique to that country, and that's what these do come across as. I don't know if they're going to be available overseas. I hope they are, so that other people can actually taste these Australian flavors. But if not, tough, we'll drink them. If this kind of breakdown is helpful, this is the sort of thing I try to do each week, like honest whiskey reviews, my opinions, and who I think these are for. So hit the subscribe button to catch the next video. But who I think these whiskies are for, I think anyone that appreciates a neat single malt and wants to actually taste things that are unique to a different country, this is going to be for you, because this doesn't come across like a Scottish whiskey. If you tasted this blind, you would assume that it comes from somewhere outside of Scotland. It's still of similar quality to a Scottish whiskey, but there's a uniqueness to it. That herbality is just like the herbal notes that are coming across in the Bourbon and the Apera cask are something that I would usually pick up on gin, where they've added botanicals, but this is authentic Australian single malt, so they haven't added any botanicals in here. So any of these herbal sort of notes, they're coming across just from the aging process. The fact that the barrel house is close to the distillery, where they're also making high quality gins, but you've got that Southern Ocean, you know, the breeze coming in to help with the aging process. You've got this temperate climate. The spirit is able to sit there in the barrel for long enough to actually develop and form its own flavor notes, which is fantastic. So yeah, Kangaroo Island Spirits releasing their first whiskies, and I think they're fantastic. They're what you would want to be able to release as a first whiskey from a distillery. So yeah, as an introduction to a new Australian whiskey to hit the market, I'm impressed, and I would vouch for it. I would say if you like exploring different whiskies, if you want to explore single malts that are a little bit more unique to the country that they're coming from, this is definitely for you. Check them out. Massive props to the flavor notes of the Tawny cask. This is probably my favorite out of the three, but if you really want to taste something that's uniquely Australian, I would say go for the Bourbon and the Apera casks, because that herbal note is really, really prevalent in there, and it tastes like the sort of herbal notes that you get from Australian bush tucker, like our native wildlife, which is fantastic. So enjoy what's in your glass, no matter where it's from, but especially if it's Australian, and slange.